I do not have a name. Let me tell you what that means, truly means. To exist as a number among numbers, a mask among masks, a soul so thoroughly stripped of individuality that even the concept of selfhood becomes foreign, a relic of weaker peoples on softer worlds who have not yet learned what it costs to seek redemption, for sins so vast that entire generations must be spent in the paying. I am Krieger, I am Death Cause, I am the inheritor of a shame so absolute that my world chose to drown itself in atomic fire, rather than live with the stain of its betrayal. And I have been raised from my first breath to understand that my life has only one purpose: to die well, to die usefully, to spend myself like ammunition in the Emperor's service, until the debt that Krieg owes has been paid in full. That debt will never be paid. This is the first truth we learn. I was designated 43229 Gamma upon my decanting, a serial number that replaced the name my gene donors might have given me in some other life, on some other world, in some existence where children were born to be loved rather than manufactured to be expended. I do not know who those donors were. I do not wish to know. The vitae womb that grew me cared nothing for heritage or lineage, or the sentimental attachments that other cultures build around the accident of biological reproduction. I was material, raw and unformed, extracted from the artificial wombs at the precise moment when my organs had developed sufficiently to begin the process of conditioning that would transform me from a squalling infant into a soldier of the Emperor's most devoted regiment. I was 4 years old when I first held a laser gun. I was 6 when I made my first kill. The target was a servitor, its flesh long dead, its movements guided by the crude programming that kept it shambling forward across the training ground toward my position. I did not know then that it was not truly alive, did not understand the distinction between the animate and the living, the moving and the sentient. I knew only that my instructors had told me to fire, and so I fired, and the servitor's head came apart in a spray of rotten meat and sparking circuitry, and I felt nothing at all, not satisfaction, not horror, not the visceral thrill that other children might experience upon achieving some milestone of development. I felt only the recoil of the weapon against my shoulder, the heat of the barrel against my gloved hands, and the quiet certainty that I had performed adequately and would not be culled from the training cohort for failure to meet the minimum standards of lethality. This is what it means to be Krieger. This is what it means to be Death Corps. Across the breadth of the Imperium, I know, other regiments train their soldiers with speeches about honor and glory, with promises of recognition and advancement, with the understanding that service rendered might one day be repaid with retirement and peace, and the simple pleasures of a life lived beyond the battlefield. The Death Corps makes no such promises. The Death Corps offers nothing but the opportunity to die, and we accept this offer with gratitude, with reverence, with the absolute conviction that death in the Emperor's service is the only gift we are worthy of receiving. We do not fight to live. We do not struggle to survive. We exist only to spend ourselves, round after round, regiment after regiment, generation after generation, until the sin of our ancestors has been washed clean in an ocean of our own blood. I was 17 years old when I left Krieg for the first time. The ship that carried us was a transport vessel of ancient design, its holds packed with 10,000 soldiers identical to myself. Masked faces, numbered designations, souls so thoroughly conditioned that we sat in perfect silence for the entire 3-month journey through the warp, requiring neither entertainment nor companionship, nor any of the comforts that other regiments demand to maintain their morale. We did not speak to one another. We did not need to speak. We understood, each of us, that we were not individuals traveling together, but components of a single weapon, being transported to the place where it would be fired. And weapons do not converse, do not form friendships, do not waste energy on anything that does not contribute directly to their function. The world we were sent to was called Vorinth Prime. I will never forget it, though I have tried. It was a fortress world, one of hundreds that lined the approaches to a sector of strategic importance, and it had been under siege for 17 years when our transport entered its orbit. The enemy was a splinter fleet of Xenos, creatures whose name I was not permitted to know, whose nature I was not permitted to understand, whose existence was classified at levels far above my designation. I knew only that they had to be destroyed, that the fortress had to be held, that the Death Corps had been summoned because other regiments had failed and broken and retreated in the face of horrors that my conditioning had prepared me to face without flinching. We did not flinch. We have never flinched. The dropships fell through Vorinth's atmosphere like seeds scattered by a farmer's hand. Thousands of vessels carrying hundreds of thousands of soldiers toward a surface that had been churned into mud and ash, and the pulverized remnants of fortifications that had been built and destroyed and rebuilt a dozen times over the course of nearly 2 decades of continuous warfare. I watched through the tiny porthole of my dropship as the ground rushed up to meet us, watched the flashes of artillery and the streaks of energy weapons and the dark clouds of smoke that rose from fires that had been burning since before I was decanted from my vitae womb. And I felt, for the first time in my existence, something that might have been anticipation, not excitement, not eagerness, but the quiet recognition that I was about to fulfill the purpose for which I had been created, that I was about to begin the process of spending myself that would continue until there was nothing left to spend. I did not know then how long that process would take. I did not know that I would still be fighting 40 years later, still wearing the same mask, still carrying the same number, still waiting for the death that would finally release me from the burden of continuation. I did not know that survival itself would become a kind of curse, that watching my brothers and sisters fall around me while I remained standing would teach me a grief that my conditioning had never prepared me to feel. I did not know that the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom or his infinite cruelty, had plans for me that extended far beyond a single battle, on a single world, in a single forgotten corner of his vast domain. I knew only that the ramp was dropping, that the mud of Vorinth Prime was waiting to receive my boots, that somewhere ahead of me, in the smoke and fire and screaming darkness, there were enemies to be killed and deaths to be died, and a debt to be paid that had been accumulating since before my great-great-grandparents had drawn their first breaths in the rad-scoured bunkers of a world that had chosen annihilation over dishonor. The death cause of Krieg does not retreat. The death cause of Krieg does not surrender. The death cause of Krieg advances and dies, and advances again with fresh bodies to replace the fallen, and this process continues until victory is achieved, or until there are no more Kriegers left to advance. And even then, I suspect, the vitae wombs of our homeworld would simply produce more of us. More masks, more numbers, more souls manufactured for the sole purpose of being expended in a war that has no end, and no mercy, and no room for anything as wasteful as individual survival. I was 17 years old when I first set foot on a battlefield. I am 61 years old now, and I am still waiting to die. Let me tell you what I have learned in the decades between. What truths have been carved into me by a lifetime of service that should have ended 1,000 times over. What it truly means to live as a Krieger, to exist without identity, without hope, without anything but the cold certainty that your death is the only gift you have to offer. and that the Emperor, in his wisdom, has not yet seen fit to accept it. The trenches of Vorinth Prime swallowed us whole. I use that word deliberately, swallowed, because there is no other term that captures the totality of immersion that occurred when we descended into those channels of mud and blood and rusted razor wire that stretched across the blasted landscape like the scars of some diseased god, carved into the flesh of a dying world. We did not enter the trenches so much as we were consumed by them, absorbed into a system of warfare so vast and so ancient that individual soldiers became meaningless, interchangeable components in a machine that had been grinding forward, inch by bloody inch, for nearly 2 decades before our boots first touched its flooded boards. The smell was the first thing. It is always the smell. Mud and cordite, and the sweet sick stench of decomposition that rose from the walls of the trenches themselves. For the walls were not merely earth and timber, but layer upon layer of the dead, bodies stacked and packed and compressed by the weight of years, until they had become structural elements, their bones reinforcing the soil, their rotting flesh providing a kind of mortar that held the whole terrible construction together. I learned later that this was standard practice on siege worlds where the Death Corps deployed. We did not waste resources on burial, did not expend energy on the sentimental disposal of remains that could serve better purpose as building material. The dead protected the living. The fallen shielded those who had not yet fallen. There was a brutal poetry in this, a liturgy of recycling that my conditioning allowed me to appreciate even as some buried fragment of humanity recoiled from the horror of it. I did not listen to that fragment. I had been trained not to listen. My unit was designated to hold a section of the line called Sector 7 Kappa, a stretch of trenches approximately 3 kilometers long that had changed hands 14 times in the past 6 years. The officer who briefed us, a watchmaster whose mask bore the scratches of decades of service, did not speak of victory or strategic objectives or any of the concepts that other regiments might use to contextualize their orders. He spoke only of holding, of enduring, of maintaining our position until we were relieved or until we were dead, whichever came first. He did not tell us which outcome was more likely. He did not need to. We understood. We always understand. The first assault came on our 3rd night in the trenches, a wave of chitinous bodies pouring across no man's land with a speed that seemed impossible for creatures of such size, their limbs churning through the mud and the wire and the scattered remains of previous assaults, as though these obstacles were merely inconveniences rather than the carefully constructed killing grounds they were meant to be. I fired my laser gun until the barrel glowed cherry red in the darkness, until the power pack clicked empty, and I slammed another into place without conscious thought, until my shoulder ached from the recoil, and my eyes burned from the flash of energy discharge, and my throat was raw from breathing air that tasted of ozone and burning flesh. 17 of my unit died in that first assault. I did not learn their designations until afterward, when the quartermaster read the list of expended assets, and I realized that soldiers I had stood beside mere hours before had been reduced to numbers on a logistics report, their deaths noted with the same dispassion that might be applied to the consumption of ammunition or the wearing out of equipment. This was not cruelty. This was efficiency. The Death Corps does not mourn its dead because mourning requires the acknowledgement that death is a loss, and we do not experience death as loss. We experience it as fulfillment, as purpose achieved, as the final payment on a debt that can only be settled in blood. I envied them. Emperor, forgive me. I envied the dead. The days blurred into one another, each one identical to the last. Stand watch, repel assault, repair fortifications, stand watch again, sleep in shifts so brief that dreams never had time to form. eat rations that tasted of nothing because our masks filtered everything, including flavor, exist in a state of perpetual readiness that left no room for thought or reflection, or any of the mental activities that might remind us we were human beings, rather than weapons waiting to be discharged. I learned the rhythm of siege warfare in those first weeks, learned to read the patterns of enemy movement, learned to predict when the next assault would come, by the way the air pressure changed and the sounds from across no man's land shifted from the grinding of excavation to the chittering of massed bodies preparing to charge. And I learned something else, something that my conditioning had not prepared me for, something that would haunt me across all the decades that followed. I learned that I was good at this, not merely adequate, not simply meeting the minimum standards required for continued existence within the Death Corps. I was exceptional, gifted with reflexes and instincts and a capacity for violence that set me apart from my brothers and sisters in ways that I did not understand and could not explain. My kill counts were higher than those around me. My survival rate through assaults that claimed entire squads was anomalous, statistical, the kind of deviation that drew the attention of officers who normally paid no attention to individual soldiers at all. I did not seek this distinction. I did not want it. But it found me nonetheless, marking me for a fate that would prove far crueler than the quick death I had been raised to desire. The Watchmaster summoned me to his command bunker on the 47th day of our deployment. I had never been inside such a structure before, had never seen the maps and tactical displays and communication equipment that allowed officers to coordinate the movements of thousands of soldiers across kilometers of front line. The bunker smelled of recaf and gun oil, and the particular chemical sweetness of stimulants that kept command staff awake through shifts that would have killed ordinary humans. The Watchmaster himself sat behind a desk covered in reports, his mask removed to reveal a face so scarred and weathered that it seemed to belong to a corpse that had not yet realized it was dead. Sunken eyes, sallow skin, lips so thin they were barely visible against the ruin of his features. "Forerun 229, Gamma," he said, and his voice was like gravel being ground beneath a tank's treads. "Your performance has been noted." I did not respond. Response was not required. "You have survived 47 days in Sector 7 Kappa. The average survival time for soldiers in this sector is 11 days. You have personally accounted for over 300 confirmed kills. You have been wounded 7 times and returned to duty within hours of each wounding." He paused, consulting a data slate that glowed sickly green in the bunker's dim lighting. "You are an anomaly, soldier. The question is what to do with you." I understood then that I was being evaluated for something, though I did not know what. Promotion, perhaps, though the Death Corps does not value rank the way other regiments do, seeing leadership as merely another form of service rather than a privilege or reward. Or perhaps something else, something worse, something that would take me away from the simple clarity of the front line and thrust me into complexities that my conditioning had not prepared me to navigate. "There is a theory," the Watchmaster continued, "held by some within our order, that soldiers like you represent a failure of the conditioning process, that your survival instincts have not been properly suppressed, that some flaw in your psychological architecture has left you with a will to live that true Kriegers should not possess." His eyes, pale as winter ice, fixed upon my mask with an intensity that seemed to bore through the lenses and into the skull beneath. "Do you wish to live, soldier? Do you fear death?" The question struck me like physical blows, challenging the very foundation of everything I had been taught to believe about myself. Did I wish to live? I had never considered the question. Did I fear death? I had been raised to view death as the only worthy goal of existence, the only gift I was capable of giving, the only means by which I might contribute to the redemption of my world and my people. And yet, I had survived when others had not. I had killed when others had died. I had continued to exist through circumstances that should have ended me 100 times over, and some part of me, some fragment that my conditioning had failed to extinguish, had been grateful for that continuation, had clung to each additional moment of life with a tenacity that shamed me, even as I could not deny its existence. "I do not know, Watchmaster," I answered, and it was the first honest thing I had said since my decanting. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could not read the expression on his ruined face. Contempt, perhaps, or recognition, or some combination of the two that defied simple categorization. "That answer," he said finally, "is why you will be transferred to the siege regiment. Your talents are wasted on this line. There are harder places, darker places, where the Korps sends those who refuse to die when they are supposed to." He leaned forward, and for a moment I thought I saw something like pity in his wasted eyes. "You will learn to hate your gift, soldier. You will beg for the death that eludes you, and perhaps, if you are fortunate, the Emperor will eventually grant your wish." He dismissed me with a gesture, and I returned to my position in the trenches, my mind churning with questions that had no answers and doubts that had no resolution. I had been marked. I had been noticed. I had been separated from the anonymous mass of my brothers and sisters and identified as something different, something singular, something that the Death Corps did not quite know how to process. I did not understand then what a curse this would prove to be. I understand now. The siege regiment was where the Death Corps sent its monsters. I do not use that word lightly. Do not employ it as metaphor or exaggeration, or the kind of dramatic flourish that other storytellers might use to heighten the impact of their tales. I mean it literally, precisely, with the cold accuracy that my conditioning instilled in me from the moment of my first conscious thought. The soldiers of the siege regiment were monsters. Not because they had been corrupted by the ruinous powers, not because they had abandoned their humanity in pursuit of forbidden knowledge, but because they had been forged by decades of warfare into something that no longer fit within the boundaries of what the human species was meant to be. They were survivors in a culture that worshipped death. They were individuals in an army that had abolished individuality. They were the ones who would not die, could not die, no matter how hard they tried, or how desperately they sought the release that claimed their brothers and sisters with such reliable frequency. I became one of them. Emperor, help me. I became one of them. The transfer took me from Vorinth Prime to a succession of other worlds, other wars, other trenches that differed from the first, only in the specific composition of the mud and the particular nature of the enemies that hurled themselves against our lines. I fought on Cadia before it fell, stood in trenches that had been held for 10,000 years and would be held for 10,000 more. Or so we believed before the despoiler came, and proved that even the most eternal fortifications could be broken by sufficient application of hatred and malice. I fought on Armageddon during the Third War, breathed air so thick with ash and promethium fumes that my rebreather filters had to be changed every 6 hours, watched orc hordes crash against our positions like green tides breaking upon cliffs of steel and determination. I fought on worlds whose names have been stricken from imperial records, against enemies whose existence has been classified at the highest levels, in battles that will never be commemorated or remembered, because the Imperium has decreed that they never happened at all. And through all of it, I survived. Through all of it, I endured. The years accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a stagnant pool, layer upon layer of experience compressing into something dense and dark and utterly unlike the simple clarity I had known as a fresh soldier on my first deployment. I watched entire regiments expended in single assaults, thousands of my brothers and sisters advancing into killing fields so perfectly designed that survival was not merely unlikely, but mathematically impossible. Their bodies piling up in drifts and mounds and eventually hills that we used as cover for the next wave of advance. I saw commanders order charges that they knew would achieve nothing, that they designed specifically to achieve nothing. Because the Death Corps measures success not in ground gained or enemies killed, but in lives spent. In the steady depletion of the debt that Krieg owes to the Emperor for the sins of our treacherous ancestors. I participated in those charges. I led some of them in the later years, when my refusal to die had been twisted into a kind of authority that I neither wanted nor deserved. The mathematics of it haunted me. In the rare moments when my mind was not occupied with the immediate demands of survival, I calculated once, during a lull in the fighting, on a world whose name I have deliberately forgotten, that I had personally witnessed the deaths of over 40,000 Krieger soldiers across my decades of service. 40,000 masked faces, 40,000 numbered designations, 40,000 souls manufactured in the vitae wombs of our homeworld and transported across the stars and expended in the Emperor's service without hesitation or complaint or any acknowledgement that their lives had value beyond their utility as ammunition in an eternal war. I had known none of them as individuals. I had not been permitted to know them, had not been conditioned to form the attachments that might make their deaths painful, rather than simply logistically significant. And yet the number grew heavy in my chest, a weight that my conditioning had not prepared me to carry. I began to notice them, the dead, the dying, the about to die, in ways that I had never noticed them before. I saw the slight hesitation in a soldier's step before they went over the top of the trench, the tremor in a hand that gripped its laser gun just a fraction too tightly, the particular angle of a masked head that suggested the person beneath was looking not at the enemy ahead, but at something far more distant, something internal, something that the conditioning had failed to fully suppress. I recognized these signs because I had begun to see them in myself, in the mirror of my mask's interior surface, in the reflection that stared back at me with eyes that held questions that should never have been formed. The siege regiment did not discuss such things. We did not have the vocabulary for doubt, the framework for questioning, the conceptual architecture that might allow us to express the growing unease that I sensed in myself and suspected in others. We simply continued to fight, continued to die, continued to advance into the darkness with the grim determination of mechanisms that had been wound too tight and could not stop moving, even when their gears began to grind and their springs began to fail. I was 34 years old when I first refused an order. The word refused is perhaps too strong. I did not voice objection, did not state my unwillingness, did not take any action that could be formally classified as insubordination. I simply failed to advance. The order came to charge a fortified position that bristled with heavy weapons, a bunker complex that had already consumed 3 previous assault waves without showing any sign of weakening. And as my brothers and sisters rose from our trenches and began their march into the killing field, I found that my legs would not carry me forward. I stood in the trench, my laser gun ready, my body positioned for the advance, and I did not move. The assault lasted 7 minutes. 234 soldiers participated. None survived. I watched them die from my position in the trench, watched the las fire and the bolt rounds and the streams of burning promethium turn living soldiers into scattered meat and scorched bone. Watched the advance falter and fail and finally cease as the last Krieger fell face first into mud that was more blood than earth. And I felt something that I had never felt before, something that my conditioning had specifically been designed to prevent, something that rose in my chest like bile and threatened to choke me with its intensity. I felt relief. I felt grateful to be alive. The shame that followed was worse than any wound I had ever received, worse than the burns and the shrapnel and the near misses that had left scars across every inch of my body. I had betrayed my conditioning. I had betrayed my regiment. I had betrayed the very purpose for which I had been created, the only function that gave my existence meaning, the debt that I was supposed to pay with my own blood, and had instead allowed others to pay on my behalf. I should have died in that assault. I should have been among the 234, my body adding to the mound of corpses that would be used to provide cover for the next wave. Instead, I was alive, and they were dead, and the mathematics of that exchange damned me in ways that no formal punishment could ever match. No one spoke of my failure. No one needed to. The Death Corps does not court-martial soldiers who fail to advance. Such proceedings would imply that individual choice exists, that personal accountability matters, that the decision to move or not move is something that falls within the scope of conscious agency, rather than simple mechanical function. Instead, I was simply reassigned, transferred to a unit designated for operations that had even lower survival expectations than the standard assault waves, placed among soldiers who had similarly failed to die when they were supposed to, and were being given additional opportunities to correct that oversight. We were the broken ones, the malfunctioning components, the weapons that had jammed at the crucial moment and could no longer be trusted to fire when the trigger was pulled. And yet, we were still Krieger. We still wore the masks. We still bore our designations with the same absence of individuality that had defined us since our decanting. The only difference was that now we understood, in ways that our properly functioning brothers and sisters did not, that something within us had cracked, that the conditioning which had shaped us from infancy had begun to fail, that we were becoming something other than what we had been designed to be. I do not know what to call what we were becoming. I am not certain that a word exists for it. Perhaps we were becoming human. The thought terrified me more than any enemy I had ever faced, more than the Xenos horrors and the heretic armies and the demonic incursions that I had witnessed across decades of unending war. To be human was to be weak, to be compromised, to be vulnerable to fears and hopes and attachments that the Death Corps had specifically engineered out of its soldiers. To be human was to betray everything that Krieg stood for, everything that our ancestors had died to establish, everything that gave meaning to the endless sacrifice that our people had offered to the Emperor since the civil war that had nearly destroyed our world. And yet I could not stop the process that had begun within me, could not force myself back into the mold that had contained me for the first 3 decades of my existence, could not pretend that the questions forming in my mind were not questions at all, but merely malfunctions to be corrected through additional conditioning and stricter discipline. The crack had formed. The conditioning had begun to fail. And through that crack, something was seeping in. Something soft, something warm, something that whispered of possibilities beyond the endless cycle of advance and death and advance again. I did not know it then, but I was about to learn what that something was. I was about to learn why the Death Corps fears its survivors more than it fears any enemy. And I was about to understand, for the first time, the true cost of the redemption that Krieg seeks, not merely in blood and bodies, and the steady expenditure of manufactured souls, but in the systematic destruction of everything that makes those souls capable of being more than ammunition, more than fuel, more than numbers on a logistics report waiting to be crossed off when the final tally is made. Her designation was 7742 Sigma. I should not have learned even that much about her, should not have allowed myself to recognize her as an individual distinct from the masked mass of soldiers that surrounded us in the deployment bay of the transport ship carrying us toward our next expenditure. But she sat across from me during the 6-week journey through the warp, and something in the way she held herself, some slight variation in posture, some barely perceptible difference in the angle of her mask, drew my attention in ways that I could not explain and could not resist. I watched her when I should have been conserving energy for the battles ahead. I noticed the way her fingers moved when she cleaned her laser gun, the particular rhythm of her breathing when she slept, the almost imperceptible tremor in her shoulders that might have been suppressed fear or might have been something else entirely. I was fascinated by her. Emperor, forgive me, I was fascinated. The world we were sent to was called Nethris 7, a mining colony that had fallen to a cult uprising 6 months before our arrival. The heretics had fortified themselves in the planet's primary extraction complex, a labyrinth of tunnels and processing facilities that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the surface, and the Death Corps had been summoned to dig them out, literally, methodically, tunnel by tunnel and chamber by chamber. The kind of grinding subterranean warfare that played to our strengths and our willingness to accept casualties that would break any other regiment in the Imperium. We descended into the darkness together, 7742, Sigma and I, assigned to the same tunnel-clearing squad by the random allocation of the quartermaster's cogitators. I told myself that this was coincidence, that the Emperor's will did not concern itself with the placement of individual soldiers within individual squads, that the universe was not so small as to arrange meetings between two broken Kriegers who had both failed to die when they were supposed to. I did not believe myself. I am not certain I was meant to. The tunnels of Nethris 7th were carved from black stone that seemed to drink the light of our stab lamps. Narrow passages that forced us to advance in single file through darkness so absolute that it pressed against us like a physical weight. The heretics had prepared their defenses well, booby traps and ambush points and kill zones where the natural choke points of the tunnel system had been enhanced with barricades and heavy weapons positions. We lost soldiers every day, sometimes every hour, their deaths marked by the sudden cessation of movement ahead of us in the column, and the wet sounds of bodies being dragged aside to clear the path for those who followed. I learned 7742 Sigma's voice during those endless hours of darkness. She spoke rarely, as all Kriegers do, but when she spoke, her words carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to their content. Observations about the tunnel structure, warnings about potential ambush points, tactical assessments delivered in a tone that suggested she was thinking about more than simply the immediate demands of the advance. I found myself listening for her voice, straining to hear it above the constant drip of water and the distant rumble of combat from other sectors, treasuring each syllable as though it were something precious rather than merely functional. This was madness. This was the very corruption that my conditioning had been designed to prevent. But I could not stop. I did not want to stop. We were 37 days into the Nethris campaign when the tunnel collapsed. I do not know what caused it. An explosive trap we failed to detect, structural weakness in the stone, the accumulated vibration of weeks of heavy weapons fire echoing through passages that had been excavated centuries before. I know only that one moment I was advancing through darkness, my laser gun ready, my senses straining for any sign of enemy contact, and the next moment the world was falling, the ceiling coming down in a cascade of black stone and choking dust, the screams of soldiers being crushed mixing with the grinding roar of geological forces that cared nothing for the fragile flesh caught in their path. I survived. I always survive. When the dust cleared and the rumblings ceased, I found myself in a pocket of space barely large enough to contain my body, my mask's filters working overtime to scrub the particulate-laden air into something breathable, my limbs trapped by debris that pressed against me from every direction. I could not move. I could barely breathe. The darkness was absolute. My stab lamp crushed somewhere beneath the rubble that had swallowed me. And I understood with cold certainty that I was going to die here, alone in the black depths of a world that did not know my name and would not remember my existence. I was not afraid. I was relieved. Finally, after all these years, after all the battles and the assaults and the endless grinding forward into death that refused to claim me, I would be permitted to rest. Finally, the debt that I had been unable to pay through proper sacrifice would be settled by the simple expedient of a tunnel collapse and the slow suffocation that would follow. I would die as I had been meant to die, anonymously, uselessly, without glory or recognition or any of the things that other soldiers might seek in their final moments. I would be one more number crossed off a logistics report, one more asset expended in the Emperor's service, one more Krieger consumed by the machinery of warfare that had been my entire existence since the moment of my decanting. I closed my eyes and waited for the end. And then I heard her voice. 4 to 229, Gamma. Can you hear me? Respond if you can hear me. It was 742, Sigma. Somewhere nearby in the darkness, her words muffled by the debris that separated us but unmistakably hers, carrying that same weight that had drawn my attention across the deployment bay, that same quality of thoughtfulness that had made her seem different from every other Krieger I had served beside. I should not have responded. Response would only prolong the inevitable, would only delay the death that I had finally accepted, would only give me hope when hope was the last thing I needed. But my conditioning failed me once again, and words emerged from my throat without my permission, clawing their way past cracked lips and a tongue thick with dust. I am here. I am trapped. Do not waste resources attempting extraction. A pause. A sound of shifting rubble, of someone moving through debris that should have been impassable, of effort being expended on a task that had no tactical value whatsoever. I'm coming, she said. Hold on. Negative. I am expended. Continue mission. That is an order. I do not know why I said that last part. I had no authority to give her orders, no rank that placed me above her in the chain of command. But the words felt right, felt like the kind of thing a proper Krieger should say when facing death in the darkness of an enemy tunnel. And some part of me hoped that they would convince her to do what I could not, to let me go, to abandon me to the fate that had been delayed for so long, to grant me the release that I had been seeking since the day I first failed to advance into that killing field on Vorinth Prime. She did not listen. She did not obey. I heard her digging, heard the scrape of stone against stone, and the grunt of effort as she shifted debris that must have weighed more than she did, heard her breathing grow labored as she worked her way toward me, through darkness so complete that she could not possibly have known which direction to dig. Minutes passed, or hours. Time had ceased to have meaning in that pocket of buried darkness. And still she continued. Still she refused to accept the death that I had finally embraced. Still she fought against the rubble and the stone and the universe itself to reach a soldier who had told her to let him die. Her hand broke through the debris and found mine. I cannot describe what I felt in that moment, cannot find words sufficient to capture the sensation of human contact after so many years of existing as a number among numbers, a mask among masks, a soul so thoroughly isolated that touch itself had become a foreign concept. Her fingers were cold and slick with blood. Her own blood, I realized, from wounds sustained in her digging, and they gripped mine with a strength that seemed impossible for a body that had just expended so much effort on a task with no tactical value. "I found you," she said, and her voice was raw with exhaustion, but also with something else. Something that I recognized because I had begun to feel it myself in the weeks of darkness and combat that had preceded this moment. "Why?" I asked, and the word contained every question I had never been permitted to ask, every doubt that my conditioning had tried to suppress, every fragment of humanity that had been slowly seeping through the cracks in my psychological architecture. "Because I could not let you die alone," she answered. "Because I have watched you across these weeks, and I have seen something in you that I see in myself, and I could not bear to lose it without trying to save it." She dug me out. It took hours more, hours of scraping and shifting, and the slow expansion of the pocket of space that contained my body, until finally I could move my limbs, could drag myself through the gap she had created, could emerge into a larger chamber where the collapse had been less complete, and the air was cleaner, and a single stab lamp, hers, cast a pool of weak light against the absolute darkness that surrounded us. I saw her face for the first time. She had removed her mask to breathe more easily while she worked, and in the dim light of the stab lamp, I beheld features that were not beautiful by any standard, not memorable or distinctive in any way. A face like any other face, scarred and weathered and marked by the same decades of warfare that had left their traces upon my own. But it was a face, a human face, and she had shown it to me when all of our conditioning had taught us that faces were irrelevant, that individuality was weakness, that the mask was not a covering, but the truest expression of what we were. "My name was Sarah," she said. "Before my decanting, my gene donors gave me that name, and I was not supposed to remember it. But I do. I've carried it with me through every battle, every assault, every moment of every day since the conditioning failed to take it from me." She was crying. I had never seen a Krieger cry. "What is your name?" she asked. "Not your designation. Your name. The name that you carry in the part of yourself that they could not destroy." I did not know. I had never known. The Vitae womb had decanted me without any identity beyond my number, and I had never thought to wonder if there might be something else, some fragment of selfhood that existed beneath the conditioning and the training and the endless preparation for a death that had never come. But in that moment, in that chamber of black stone, with her bloodied hand still gripping mine, and her tears catching the light of the stab lamp, I understood that it did not matter whether I had a name or not. What mattered was that she had asked. What mattered was that she had seen me not as a number or a function or an asset to be expended, but as something capable of possessing a name, of carrying an identity, of being more than the conditioning that had tried to reduce me to nothing but a weapon waiting to be discharged. "I do not know my name," I told her, "but I think I would like to find it." She smiled, the first smile I had ever seen on a Krieger's face, and the expression transformed her features into something that I could only describe as alive, truly alive, in a way that I had never understood human beings could be. "Then we will find it together," she said, "if we survive this." We survived. We should not have, but we did, and nothing was ever the same after that. Sarah died on Nethris 7, not in the tunnels where she had saved me, not in the darkness where she had shown me her face and asked me for a name I did not possess. She died 3 weeks later, during the final assault on the Heretic Command Center, when a plasma bolt caught her in the chest and burned through her armor, and turned everything she had been into scattered ash, and the fading echo of a smile that I had seen only once but would carry with me for the rest of my existence. I was beside her when it happened. I watched her fall, and I learned in that moment what grief truly was. Not the abstract acknowledgement of loss that my conditioning had permitted me to feel when my brothers and sisters were expended around me, but the raw and terrible weight of losing something that had become precious, something that had given meaning to an existence that had previously contained nothing but the cold mathematics of debt and payment. She had shown me what it felt like to be seen as more than a number. She had given me, in the brief weeks between the tunnel collapse and her death, a glimpse of what human connection might be, what it might mean to exist not merely as a weapon waiting to be discharged, but as a soul capable of touching another soul and being touched in return. And then she was gone, and I was alone again, and the universe seemed darker than the tunnels where she had found me. I did not die after Nethris 7. I should have. I wanted to. The campaigns continued, an endless procession of worlds and wars and opportunities for the death that I now sought, with a desperation that went beyond my conditioning, beyond my training, beyond anything that the vitae wombs of Krieg had designed me to feel. I threw myself into every assault, volunteered for every suicide mission, positioned myself at the front of every advance where the killing was thickest and the chances of survival were slimmest. My kill counts climbed into numbers that required scientific notation to express. My body accumulated scars until there was more scar tissue than original flesh, until I became a map of violence written in the language of plasma burns and shrapnel wounds and the near misses that should have been direct hits. And still, I did not die. Still, the Emperor refused to accept my offering. I am 61 years old now. I have served in the Death Corps for 44 years. I have participated in campaigns on over 30 worlds, have witnessed the deaths of more Kriegers than I can count, have become something that my younger self would not have recognized. An old soldier in an army where old soldiers should not exist. A survivor in a culture that views survival as failure. A walking contradiction that the Corps does not know how to classify or dispose of. They have made me a watchmaster, a rank I never sought and do not deserve. I train the young ones now, the fresh soldiers decanted from the vitae wombs and conditioned in the training facilities and shipped to whatever world requires their expenditure. I look at their masked faces and I see myself as I once was, blank, purposeful, utterly convinced that death is the only gift worth giving, and that the debt of Krieg is the only truth worth serving. They do not know what I know. They have not learned what I have learned. They have not felt the touch of another soul in the darkness of a collapsed tunnel, have not carried the weight of grief that comes from losing something precious, have not discovered that beneath the conditioning and the training and the careful engineering of their psychology, there exists something that refuses to be extinguished no matter how hard the Corps tries to snuff it out. They are weapons. I was a weapon once. But I have become something else. Something that has no name in the vocabulary of Krieg. Something that my culture would destroy if it understood the full extent of my transformation. I have become a person who wants to live. Not for glory, not for recognition, not for any of the rewards that other soldiers might seek as compensation for their service. I want to live because Sarah showed me that life itself has value, that existence is not merely a debt to be paid, but a gift to be experienced, that the breath in my lungs and the blood in my veins and the thoughts in my mind are precious beyond measure, precisely because they are finite, precisely because they will end, precisely because the darkness that waits for all of us makes every moment of light something to be treasured rather than merely endured. This is heresy. By the standards of Krieg, by the conditioning that shaped me, by the culture that manufactured me to serve a single purpose, this desire for life is the worst kind of betrayal. I should report myself to the commissariat. I should confess my corruption and accept whatever punishment they deem appropriate. I should be culled from the regiment like the malfunctioning component that I am, my genetic material recycled into the vitae wombs so that some future soldier might be grown from my flesh without inheriting the flaws that have made me unfit for service. I have not reported myself. I do not intend to. Instead, I train the young ones, and I watch them with eyes that see more than masked faces and numbered designations. I look for the ones like me, the ones like Sarah, the ones in whom the conditioning has failed to take complete hold. I cannot save them. The machinery of Krieg is too vast, too thorough, too perfectly designed to allow for salvation on any meaningful scale. But I can see them. I can acknowledge their existence. I can offer them, in small moments when the watchers are not watching, the knowledge that they are not alone in their corruption, that somewhere in the endless ranks of the Death Corps, there are others who have discovered the terrible secret that our culture tries so hard to suppress. We are human, beneath the masks, beneath the numbers, beneath the conditioning and the training and the careful destruction of everything that makes individuality possible. We are human beings, with souls that yearn for connection, and hearts that ache with grief, and minds that cannot help but ask the questions that we are not supposed to ask. This is the brutal truth of the Death Corps of Krieg, not the brutality of the warfare, not the horror of the casualty rates, not the grim determination with which we march into deaths that we have been raised to welcome. The true brutality is what they do to us before we ever reach the battlefield, the systematic annihilation of selfhood, the deliberate destruction of everything that might make us more than weapons, the cold and calculated murder of the humanity that exists within every soul, decanted from the vitae wombs of our blighted world. Krieg seeks redemption for the sins of its ancestors. This is what we are taught. This is what we believe. This is the foundation upon which our entire culture has been built for generations beyond counting. But I have come to understand that no redemption can be purchased through the destruction of what makes us capable of seeking redemption in the first place. You cannot pay a debt by annihilating the debtor. You cannot atone for betrayal by betraying everything that makes atonement meaningful. The Death Corps does not seek redemption. It seeks extinction, the slow and grinding erasure of humanity from the souls of its soldiers, the transformation of people into ammunition, of children into weapons, of an entire civilization into nothing but fuel for fires that will never burn hot enough to cleanse the sin that we carry. I do not know if the debt of Krieg can ever be paid. I do not know if redemption is possible for a world that chose atomic fire over surrender, that has manufactured billions of soldiers to die in wars that have no end, that has built its entire identity around the proposition that death is the only gift worth giving. But I know this: Sarah's name was worth more than all the deaths I have witnessed. Her smile, glimpsed once in the light of a single stab lamp in the darkness of a collapsed tunnel, contained more meaning than 44 years of service and sacrifice, and the steady expenditure of souls too numerous to count. I do not have a name. The vitae womb did not give me one, and the conditioning ensured that I never thought to seek one. But I carry hers. I carry it with me into every battle, every assault, every moment of every day, that the Emperor sees fit to extend my existence beyond the death that I have been seeking since before I understood what death truly meant. Sarah, it is not much. It is everything. And when I finally fall, when the lass fire or the shrapnel or the simple weight of years finally catches up with me and grants me the release that I have been denied for so long, I will carry that name into whatever darkness waits beyond, and I will know that I was more than a number, more than a mask, more than a weapon waiting to be discharged. I will know that I was human, and in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the endless sacrifice of souls manufactured for slaughter, that knowledge is the closest thing to redemption that any Krieger can hope to find.